Today, we celebrate the Transfiguration. So we have a continuation of the pattern that occurs during the first half of the church year, where we celebrate major events in the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. The Transfiguration is a particularly joyous and beautiful festival, especially for us as liberal Catholics. As we've said many times in the past, for us, the Christian path is a path of transformation, of awakening the Christ within. And this festival has a very beautiful esoteric meaning that can help us along this path. As we go to the collect for today, we ask that we, thy humble servants, may also in due time ascend the holy mountain and be transfigured into thy likeness. So straight away, we know that as we celebrate this festival, we are meant to consider the inner transformation that we need to undertake as we proceed along the Christian path. So before I go into the esoteric meaning of the festival, I'll just say a little bit about what happened at the Transfiguration, because it's important. There's a lot of symbolism in this story. So basically this event happened at a time during Jesus' ministry when he'd already been performing miracles, he was already quite famous, and he was known to draw large crowds. But this event didn't happen in front of a large crowd. Indeed, it didn't even happen in front of all 12 disciples. There are only 3 of Jesus' disciples that were with him, Peter, James, and John. And they went up a mountain, and when they reached the top of this mountain, this is recounted in today's Gospel, which is from St. Matthew. Matthew 17, if you want to check it out. And he was transfigured, so he began to shine. There was light streaming from him. His raiment was white as the light, and as it says here, his face did shine as the sun. And in addition to this, not only was Jesus' appearance magically transformed into just this ray of light, but 2 figures appeared next to him, and the 2 figures were Moses and Elias. And as we might recall, these are both major figures in the Old Testament. Moses brought the law down to the Israelites. He helped free the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and took them across the Red Sea, and then he ascended Mount Sinai and got given the 10 Commandments in stone tablets, which he brought down to the Israelites. Now, Moses, apparently, he died a natural death and was buried by God. Elias, on the other hand, he was a prophet. So he said lots of prophecies and lots of things that to our waking mind might sound rather strange, but which helps to wake the people up. He, though, didn't die a natural death, but rather he was assumed into heaven. So you might be familiar with the story of the Assumption of Mary. Mary's not the only person who got assumed into heaven. Elias was also assumed into heaven. And I'm telling you these details because they're kind of important for the esoteric interpretation of the Transfiguration narrative. So basically these 2 very important Old Testament figures, who each represented a slightly different aspect of life and death, appeared next to Jesus while he was shining. And Peter said, "Oh, let's build 3 tabernacles here." And then they kind of disappeared, and a voice came down from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him." So this was obviously the voice of the Father. And they were all afraid, but Jesus came, touched them, and said, "Arise and be not afraid." They lifted up their eyes, and the scene was back to normal. Jesus was back in his usual human form. So, what does this story mean? Well, in the Epistle, which is from the second Epistle General of St. Peter. So in other words, this is written by one of the witnesses to this miraculous event. We have a bit of a clue. Right at the end, Peter says, "We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts." So we have this beautiful passage here, "until the day star arise in your hearts." And what this tells us is that when we're thinking about the Transfiguration, we shouldn't just think about this as some miraculous event that happened 2,000 years ago, but rather we should look at how this event can influence our own spiritual transformation and help us to help the day star arise in our hearts. In other words, the awakening of the Christ within. And there's a number of clues in this story that tell us this. For starters, Jesus, James, Peter and John are ascending a mountain. We know that ascending a mountain is generally a metaphor for the process of spiritual transformation. I mentioned before also that Moses ascended the mountain to receive the Ten Commandments. We find this in Scripture a lot. These major figures in Scripture ascend a mountain and then they meet God. So what this is telling us is that we need to continue proceeding along the path that Jesus has laid out for us, so that we too can ascend the inner mountain of spiritual transformation. The other bits of symbolism, there's a really obvious one, which is Jesus's face and raiment shining as the light. And what this represents is that at this point in his ministry, Jesus had reached a point where the Christ within was so strong that it was shining brightly and it was radiating upon the world. And this event was a physical manifestation of that. Now, he only showed this to 3 of his disciples. He didn't do it in front of a large crowd. There was a limited audience. And what this tells us is that this particular point in the spiritual journey is at a later stage. We're not talking about something that can happen right at the start when you first convert to Christianity, but it's something that requires hard work. It requires ascending the mountain, and it's a place where we might not necessarily get to in this lifetime, and indeed not until after many, many lifetimes. That's why there's only 3 of these disciples, the 3 that were quite close to Jesus. And let's talk a little bit about the 2 figures that appeared. I mean, I already mentioned Moses and Elias and spoke about how they lived and also how they passed away. What this represents is that both humanity's mortality, and this is through the appearance of Moses. Moses is the lawgiver. He brings the law down to the Israelites. Then he dies a natural death, but he is buried by God. Then we have the ability to transcend death, and we have this through the appearance of Elias. Elias was assumed into heaven, and in the middle of them we have the Christ. The Christ is the bridge. Jesus Christ is the truth, the way, and the life. As the Gospel of John says, none shall go to the Father but by him. So we have here this human aspect represented by Moses and this divine aspect represented by Elias. And in between them, we have the Christ. And the Christ is transfigured and shines as the light. So what this tells us is that if we follow Christ's teachings and proceed along the path, ascend up the mountain, we too may someday transcend physical death. So this is a wonderful story that should give us a lot of hope as Christians. I encourage you to think about this, meditate on it. Have a read of the Gospel for today, perhaps do some Lectio Divina with this particular Gospel passage, and see how this story of the Transfiguration can help you to transform your life. A second.